Hello students, welcome to Lecture 9 in the History of Terrorism course where we will be looking a little bit at an overview of militant Islam. This is obviously a huge topic. Hundreds of books now have been written about it since the 2001 attacks, and there's really more to this story than we can possibly go into uh, in a brief lecture. Uh, Chalion and Blinn, they do a very good job of sort of providing a nice deep history, an overview of the splits within Islam and some of the key factors in the rise of Islamism or militant Islam leading up to today. So I will be brief here and just give you some highlights. In a nutshell, militant Islam could be said to have originated from uh, various historical phenomena. The first is, as we've seen over the last few classes, the failure of secular Arab states. And what do we mean by failures? Well, the failures of secular Arab states in particular, and not just secular Arab states, but secular states with a majority Islamic population, such as those throughout Central Asia in the various stands that are of Turkic origin. These secular states failed for a number of reasons. First of all, they were uniformly autocratic. Their citizens were not given basic rights. Their citizens were not given basic opportunities. They were repressive. They denied fundamental human values to their population. So that was one failure. The second failure, of course, came in the post-war World War II era when the rise of Israel, established largely with the help of the United States, but also with its allies, ejected many Palestinians from their homeland in the region that is now Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, and so on. And this galvanized the Arab world, who viewed it as a kind of second wave of colonialism. And so the secular Arab states, namely Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq to a lesser extent, Lebanon to a lesser extent, fought several wars against Israel and lost each. So that really led to frustration and a realization that these governments were incapable of leading the Arab resistance movement. They were also incapable of creating Arab unity or Islamic unity, which is really what militant Islamists aspire to. One of the things your textbook says is that they don't really have a political objective and therefore they can't be negotiated with. It's really true that to this point, the most extreme elements of militant Islam have not offered any kind of framework for negotiation. It's impossible to negotiate with them because their only demand is capitulation. But it's really not true that they don't have a political objective. They do have a political objective. Al-Qaeda's handbooks and their public statements have always been unequivocal. They want to found an Islamic state under Sharia, living under Sharia law, a very specific form of Sharia law that has their own framework of interpretation, this fundamentalist interpretation. But they want to use this territory then to expand their Islamic state and sweep away all Arab secular states and recreate the Islamic Caliphate. And the Caliphate, of course, was the unified world of Islam that followed immediately after the death, first with Muhammad and then after the Prophet Muhammad's death in the 7th century. And the first Caliphate lasted until the 13th century. So the idea is to reunite the Islamic world under this classical banner of the Caliphate. So that's their political objective. Globalization has had a lot to do with the rise of Islamism, not just because globalization has pressured traditional values around the world. And you can see that in every Muslim country. There's a great conflict of the sort of colonialist model of women who are independent, women who are equal to men, for example, just the shift in gender roles and so on that globalization has continued to foster, economic developments, media developments, all of these things that we lump under the term globalization really means the conflict or the potential conflicts between a modern forward-looking world and a more traditional conservative world that many Muslims espouse. In its most extreme form, and I stress in its most extreme form, this takes root as militant Islam. Now, historical causes that are more immediate and more obvious are a couple. First of all, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which drew fighters from around the Muslim world to the banner of these mujahideen, those who fight jihad in Central Asia against the communist, godless, atheistic Soviets. That was really a turning point in 1979 and onward. But after that, these groups faded from the scene, although they gained vast experience there, both combat and otherwise. They largely faded from the scene, worked behind the scenes until the 1990s, when really the first Gulf War brought them once again to the fore and sort of galvanized them, because that was another act of aggression. It was seen by a foreign Western state, in this case the United States, attacking an Arab Muslim country. First of all, before we go further, it's important to say that radical Islam has been always said by most talking heads and most scholars to be represented by less than 1% of Muslims worldwide. But I would go beyond that. I would say it's 99.9% of Muslims reject these positions. It's only a tiny, tiny handful of radicals that we're talking about. And it's important that we understand that Islam itself has very little to do with these radical positions held by the people that make the nightly news. Radical Islam is based obviously on a fundamentalist interpretation of Quran and Hadith. And Hadith, I should mention, are sayings of the Prophet collected after the Prophet's death and interpreted by scholars to understand how one is supposed to live as a devout Muslim, how, for example, court cases should be tried, and so on. The Hadith, along with the Quran, read together, provide a framework, a religious and cultural framework for the success of an Islamic society. Salafi Islam is the most popular form of radical Islam because obviously not all fundamentalists are radicals. And I want you to think about that. There are many fundamentalist Muslims, just like there are many fundamentalist Christians, fundamentalist Jews. These are people that really believe in literal interpretations of Scripture with very little leeway in terms of introduction of philosophical systems of understanding Scripture, of biblical or Quranic exegesis, that is, the interpretation of the text. So fundamentalists are numerous, but very few of them are radicals in terms of radical militant Islamists or radical militant Christians. So just because one's a fundamentalist doesn't make you violent. I wanted to clarify that. Also, Salafi Islam and Wahhabi Islam are often lumped together. They're not really the same thing. Wahhabi Islam is the state religion of Saudi Arabia. It is a puritanical form of Islam that, again, wants to return Islam to its roots. It's seen as largely reactionary, demands a respect for a very strict form of and a very punitive form of Sharia law that begins really with corporal punishment as a foundation for the legal code. But Wahhabism, which was founded by Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab in the 18th century, has flourished largely because of the relationship of the Wahhabi clerics with the House of Saud, the Saudi royal family, the Saud tribe that founded what obviously today is Saudi Arabia, that controls most of the Arabian Peninsula. So it's via Saudi resources and Saudi networks that Wahhabis are able to sort of proselytize and spread their influence worldwide, and some of them have radicalized, and a number of them have undertaken militant Islamic activities. Of course, most notoriously Osama bin Laden, who was a prominent member of Saudi society. Salafi Islam, on the other hand, is a Sunni movement with strong ties with the Hanbali school of Islamic jurisprudence, and there are several different fundamental schools of Islamic jurisprudence that I mentioned have different approaches to handling the philosophy and prosecution of the legal structure of the religion. And most importantly, influenced by Ibn Taymiyyah, who's mentioned and discussed, I think, pretty well in your Shelion and Blind book. Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 1328, he was really quite a radical thinker for even in his day. He died in prison. His views were controversial when he was alive, and really what his importance, or his main importance within militant Islam, is the doctrines that he developed to cope with a number of challenges faced by the Muslim world during his lifetime. Among these, the Mongol attacks on the Islamic Caliphate and the Crusades. He saw these as necessitating a more active struggle, that is, jihad against these foreign invaders, and that it was incumbent on believers not simply to practice the pillars of Islam, that is, to undertake pilgrimage and pray and give alms and so forth, but that jihad had to be at the top of the list. That without this struggle, violent struggle against one's enemies, that Islam could not survive. So Ibn Taymiyyah is read today throughout madrasas, that is, Islamic religious schools throughout the Middle East and Central Asia, as if he were still alive. His texts are extremely important. He's a really important thinker for fundamentalist Muslims and Muslim radicals. And he deals with things that allow fatwas that, for example, condone suicide attacks, because Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, faced the dilemma of what to do when Islam was assaulted by the Mongols. When the Mongols attacked Muslim cities, they drove Muslim civilians ahead of their armies, and the defenders on the walls in the Muslim cities had to decide whether they should fire their catapults and primitive artillery at these guys, meaning they would kill fellow Muslims, not just Mongols. And Ibn Taymiyyah basically argues persuasively that essentially the needs of the many outweigh the needs of those immediate few, and yes, you can kill Muslims in that situation that would be perceived as innocent. And of course, you can see very easily how such a leap can be made from a 14th century text of this kind to today's battlefield, where an IED, a car bomb, or some other kind of remotely detonated device will kill many innocent people, and maybe not even hit the target that you really are supposedly fighting against. Salafis believe, really it comes from Salaf, predecessors, some translated as ancestors, or the first ones. It is those that really lived in the generation of the Prophet and formed the vanguard of the Islamic conquests and the first Muslim society. They're considered the greatest generation by Islam. Salafis believe that those closest to the Prophet, and obviously the Prophet himself, are the really only ones worthy for emulation, as one asks the questions of how to live a good life. The model of the Sunnah, that is, the behavior and the body of sayings of the Prophet, form the foundation of Sunni Islam. These are best interpreted through this sort of very basic, bare, Spartan fundamentalist perspective. That is, you don't need to add philosophy or any kind of advanced thinking. That there are basic, simple frameworks with which to view these people's actions and lives that become then therefore a model of one's own. Again, Salafi Islam is often linked to Wahhabi Islam, but it's not quite that simple, and some sects within, or some subgroups within those two sects criticize one another and consider one or the other in error. Jihad in radical Islam, you see that laid out in your book. The greater jihad, the jihad of the self, the inner jihad, lesser jihad, the jihad of the of the body of fighting the enemy, the infidel. It's actually not really quite true. I mean, jihad, the greater jihad has always really been stressed from the very beginning as the active jihad of fighting in the path, fi sabilillah, in the path of God. That means to go out and fight those unbelievers that bar the progress of Islam in the world. The best book on this is David Cook's book on jihad, which I encourage you to look at if you're more interested in this, who traces a whole historical development through the Arabic texts on what jihad really means and how it changes over the centuries. Jihad, though, broadly is defensive. That is, it's defensive warfare, even if it is preemptive. It is to be waged in expectation of future threats, for example, against the community. It's fought to preserve the community from physical, temporal threats to the Ummah, that is, the Muslim community that we've learned about over the last few weeks. And jihad today is seen by many, and I think it's fair to see it that way, as a response to decades of abuse, neglect, and marginalization of Muslims at home and on the world stage. And again, this has a lot to do with the fact that most Muslim Arab states, or all Muslim Arab states actually, with rare exception, maybe we could say Lebanon, but until the Arab Spring were universally autocracies with tyrannical rulers and no real civil rights. And of course, that I think goes a long way to explaining the repression that creates the environment in which these kind of views can flourish. Jihadis overall aim to unify the Muslim world in a new caliphate. The first was destroyed by the Mongols in the 13th century, and its successor, which was taken up by the Ottoman Turks, was abolished by Kemal Ataturk in 1924. So there's been no caliph of Islam since 1924. The goal is to establish a state that would be powerful enough to proclaim a caliphate. Although people have proclaimed themselves caliphs, they've never had any kind of substantial political power. So take a real nation state with significant political power to declare and prosecute a caliphate. The rule is strictly interpreted Sharia law, which again varies from society to society, but broadly speaking, it's a basic framework of derived from Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet and his followers, that is the Hadith, his sayings, and certain schools of Islamic jurisprudence, which vary from place to place. The total rejection of Western philosophical and cultural influences, whether that is gender roles or things like Marxism or existentialism or nihilism, whatever ism that you're talking about, that has often crept into modern Islamic interpretations in particular, or even ancient Muslim interpretations, things like Greek philosophy. These are to be utterly rejected as useful tools to interpret Islam. Radical Islamists believe that today we're living in the age of the Jahiliyyah. The Jahiliyyah basically is the age of ignorance, where there's great darkness in the world, and where even many Muslims are blinded and not really living their faith properly. You can still see today that the large Muslim diaspora, that includes Turks in Germany, in France, it's North Africans, Maghrebis, that it would be Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, face great discrimination, bad working conditions, bad living conditions, bigotry in the workplace. They live in slums, and it's not much better elsewhere throughout Europe. There's a great sort of cultural friction between supposed Western humanist values and the way they treat outsiders. I mentioned obviously the failure of secular groups like the PLO and Palestine People for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, to deliver victory in the Palestine question in the war against Israel. So these secular groups had their say, they had their chance. These were Marxist groups based on, again, a Western philosophy and largely not Islamic, although they had Islamic undercurrents, and they failed. And so that failed effort reflects on this generation, and they have been rejected by the younger generation of jihadi fighters. I mentioned also, and it's worth stressing, the autocratic nature of these Arab states, some of which I list here, but that would conclude, again, up until 2011, the Arab Spring, virtually every state in the Middle East and North Africa. The response, of course, to hostility to Israel, which is seen as a neo-colonial enterprise, a thieving state, a crusader state as it's often called. The Zionists and Crusaders lump Israel and the U.S. in bed together in what the Palestinians and other Muslims view as an unholy alliance. And this triggers radical Islamic response. Radical Muslims often believe they have, or they always believe, they have a unique and the only correct understanding of Allah and His will. It's necessary to declare Muslims apostate, that is in a state of takfir, which makes it permissible to attack them. And I mentioned this has roots again with Ibn Taymiyyah and how to get around this thorny notion of, don't wage fitna, don't have a division within in Islamic society. Of course, Islamic society today is extremely divided, but the quest for unity makes this a thorny issue. So in order for Muslims to be fair game, as it were, many of them have to be declared not really Muslim, that is, they're apostates, and it makes it legally permissible, and again, to attack them. And of course, this is something that, again, 99.9% of Muslim people are horrified by, because it is a way to, it's mental gymnastics to allow murder of innocent civilians. And it's easy to see that radical Muslim extremists have killed far more Muslims than they have the kuffar, the infidel, that they fight against. So Muslim societies in Egypt and elsewhere have suffered heavy attack by these agents, and have suffered just as much as, say, the United States. And I'm not talking about uniformed personnel, I'm talking here about civilians. The number of civilian deaths in the Muslim world has far exceeded that in the Western world from these guys. A jihad against unbelievers is central to living the faith. It really is at the top of all the pillars in their view, even though it's not one of the all. Sunni radicalism, as I mentioned, the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a major turning point. It drew fighters from all around the Islamic world, from Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, all the way to the Maghreb and North Africa. A lot of Egyptians fought in this campaign. And of course, in this, they were encouraged by the United States and especially Saudi Arabia. This was a plan by the United States government to make the Soviet Union bleed the way we had bled in Vietnam. It was seen as an opportunity to greatly weaken the Soviet Union during the Cold War through proxy warfare. And again, the Saudis were happy to rid their country of their radical elements by sending them off to fight and hopefully, from their perspective, to die fighting the Soviets, at least to keep them out of the country. And they're also happy to pay for it. Basically, they matched U.S. contributions to the war dollar for dollar. During and after the war, the Saudis also were building influence in Pakistan and throughout Central Asia through the establishment of Muslim schools, Muslim madrasas that would teach Wahhabi Islam, which again, the Islam that the Saudi state wants to, throughout Indonesia and elsewhere in Asia, that they want to establish, of course, is Wahhabi Islam, because this, they feel, gives the Saudi state the most long reach and the most influence over the Muslim communities abroad. And so this is why they're proselytizing and spreading this version of the faith. Again, the failure of the PLO and the first intifada against Israel in 1987 to 93, which led to the Palestinian Authority and limited governance in the West Bank and Gaza. This was really, again, not enough, not seen as a decisive victory over Israel, that in what a conflict that had now been going on for almost 50 years at this point. Some representative groups of Sunni radicalism: Hamas, al-Qaeda, of course, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Boko Haram, Jabhat al-Nusra, and many others. Of these, al-Qaeda distinguishes itself for its global reach. These others to this point are really local or regional groups with local or regional aims. Jabhat al-Nusra is perhaps the most local at this point. Their goal is simply the overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria. Shiite radicalism was a lot later in developing. There were obviously developments of Shiite radicals influenced by Marxism in the 1970s, but it really took the Iranian Revolution of 1979 that brought the Ayatollah Khomeini into power, that swept away these Marxist elements of Iranian society, that destroyed the power of the Shah, who was a conservative, right-wing autocrat, and eliminated the credibility of the United States within Iranian society and Western influences in Iranian society that allowed the Revolutionary Guards of Iran to spread a distinctive Shiite form of radicalism. And it took even longer, and it depended on Lebanese clerics, to create a tremendous leap for Shia Muslims, which was the use of suicide attacks. Excuse me, the Iranians, up until very, very recently, were never associated with suicide attacks. That has finally changed under, again, Lebanese Shiite Hezbollah influence. Shiite radicalism is really often directed in operations to punish the United States for perceived misdeeds. For example, not long ago, there was an Iranian attack allegedly on the Saudi ambassador to the United States, foiled in New York City. And this kind of operation is the sort of thing that would cause embarrassment to the Iranian government and then lead them to retaliate through their proxies, mainly Hezbollah, which they've done in the past. There is a political objective, the formation of the caliphate, to purify Islam as a religious objective, to create a pure form of Islam and impose on the mass of Muslims. It is, as I mentioned and is discussed in the text, politically inflexible. The moral superiority and the completely deep-held belief, that intractable belief that these people are correct, means that there's no wiggle room for negotiation. They have to fight, they have to be victorious, or they have to be defeated. That's how this movement works. So the movement's sustained really by the recruitment of new foot soldiers to replace losses, and the conditions for its survival, as I've already outlined, are historically contingent. This is the latest wave of terrorism, and we've seen in this class now what you could say would probably be 4 major waves of terrorism, radical Islam being the 4th. And once conditions within the Muslim world change, radical Islamic militants will also change with the times. Perhaps they'll grow stronger, perhaps they'll go weaker. We're living in the midst of this right now, so only time will tell. So far, though, efforts to radicalize through propaganda of the deed, through these spectacular terrorist attacks like 9/11, Khobar Towers, and so on, they've failed because mainstream Muslims do not want to, they're not violent, and they don't want a violent world. And so this call to jihad has really fallen on largely deaf ears. Hamas operates in Gaza, which is here in the eastern Mediterranean, on the southwestern coast by Israel. It's officially part of the Palestinian territories. It's only a tiny strip of land, 25 miles long, 6 to 12 miles wide, depending where you are. You see Gaza City there in the upper part of the map on the left. And such a small territory has a very large population of 1.5 million Palestinians. Founded in 1987, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Egyptian fundamentalist revivalist movement we'll talk a little bit about. Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, or the Islamic Resistance Movement, is the longer name of the group. Hamas means simply zeal. In 1988, it published its Covenant of the Islamic Resistance Movement, which you have in your Voices of Your book. One of the founding members was Sheikh Yassin. who died in 2004. He'd been a quadriplegic since the age of 12, and he was a spiritual leader and co-founder, along with Abdulaziz al-Rantisi, focused on charitable work and humanitarian assistance, which was one of the things that really set Hamas apart from, say, the PLO. PLO did not have the sustained fundamental human element that Hamas began with, which was schools, hospitals, feeding the hungry, taking care of orphans, taking care of widows. These were the sorts of things that really established Hamas and gave them the foothold within the Palestinian community. Interestingly, it was Sheikh Yassin and his followers who pioneered the use of suicide attacks in Israel, which was a shocking and new form of terror activity, to use of suicide belts on buses and in restaurants and so on. I've visited the scenes of several of these attacks, and today the scars are still quite deep from the Hamas suicide attack campaign that has, of course, led to the building of the security fence by the Israeli state. It's one of the things that justifies a lot of the strong-arm tactics of the Israeli government as they seek to defend their citizenry. I actually talked to the Shin Bet, that is Israeli intelligence interrogator, who interrogated Sheikh Yassin, who, when he was incarcerated by the Israeli state. Finally, he was broken and gave in and gave over a lot of intelligence and a lot of his fellow operatives to the Israeli state. But Hamas remains a formidable and powerful enemy of the Israeli government, and the democratically elected body that controls Gaza and has split the Palestinian territories in their governance. So the West Bank is really controlled by Fatah, the old PLO and its representatives, while Gaza is controlled by Hamas. And you can see here in a few of these more spectacular terrorist attacks and what led to the split and the animosity between Hamas and the PLO. Yasser Arafat in 1996 was worried that Hamas, and rightly so, was going to overtake his movement, was undermining his cause. And in fact, Hamas is militarily stronger than the PLO at this point in time. They seized control of Gaza in 2007 and were confirmed by popular elections later on. Hamas helps Israel to enforce a Gaza blockade. This actually strengthens Hamas in many ways. Politically, it allows them to show that Israel is a constant enemy, and it allows them also to maintain a kind of crisis state within Gaza, shortages that allow them to manipulate both the economy but also the social mood of the inhabitants of Gaza. They control all aspects of the economy, regulate private wealth. If you're too wealthy in Gaza, it's not a good thing. Hamas comes knocking and they confiscate your money. I think it was everyone over $1 million basically had everything they owned taken by Hamas at one point. And they brook no resistance. You cannot stand up to these guys or you're going to get yourself in serious trouble, as several clerics of minority sects have found out. Also, you hear a lot of talking heads and people that claim to know what they're talking about. It's a Sunni-Shia divide, Sunni-Shia, they're at each other's throats. Well, Hamas is actually a partner of Iran, the most powerful Shia state in the region, and also a partner of Hezbollah, the Iranian Shia proxy, even though Hamas itself is a radical Sunni organization. Iran provides the weaponry. Hamas uses the rockets that they fire into Israel and so on. This is provided by Iran. So, stop and think when you hear these generalizations. 2004, Hamas struck with the first female suicide bomber. Sheikh Yassin was killed by an Israeli missile in 2004, and this launched this war of car bombings, hijacking, suicide attacks, missile launches, rocket launches, and Israeli retaliatory strikes. That really was a simmering terror campaign and low-intensity war between Hamas and Israel. 2006, I mentioned the elections in which Hamas won a landslide victory. And then in 2008, the Gaza war with Israel, which left hundreds and hundreds dead in Gaza and thousands wounded. During the 2008 war, Hamas faced internal opposition. They, from what we know, tortured and killed 18 Gazan citizens, Palestinians, whom they accused of collaborating with the Israelis, and many more were killed, obviously, by the Israelis. But I'm trying to give you a sense of how, unfortunately, this democratic elected group is extremely autocratic in their behavior. The Israeli reaction I just mentioned, the Gaza War of 2008 to 2009, it is extreme. Most would say overreaction. 1,400 Palestinians killed, hundreds of them children, 4,000 homes were destroyed, government buildings destroyed, the infrastructure of the country was wrecked, and this is just overkill. The Israeli response is retaliate with extreme prejudice. It's cost them dearly in world opinion, and shows basically that this little state is under a state of siege by its more powerful neighbor. Hamas, still around today. No Western government knows what to do with them. They're extremely effective politically. They have an authoritarian grip on their state. They're completely in control. They have no interest whatsoever in a negotiated peaceful settlement with Israel. They like to keep things on the simmer at a sufficient level of hostility that plays into their hands and justifies their existence, which is one of the problems when you're a militant. How do you continue to justify your existence? Well, you don't want peace, do you? U.S. is regarded as an enemy, but the U.S., as Hamas has stated, is not a target of their attack. They do not seek to attack the U.S. They rather fight Israel. They have at least a $70 million annual budget, and as I mentioned, they're strengthening their ties with Iran and Hezbollah. Although cracks have emerged in this picture because of the Syrian civil war, in which Hamas withdrew its people from Syria in opposition to the Assad regime slaughtering thousands and thousands of Sunni civilians. So there are cracks in that relationship, which has certainly not been severed yet. One thing that is often discussed is, peace. Whatever peace is made by a group like Hamas, the Arabic word is hudu, versus salam, which is the permanent peace versus basically a truce. So hudu or hudu versus salam, a truce versus permanent peace. And they're both often used, the word is peace in English, but they mean very, very different things in Arabic. Basically, Israel cannot win this conflict militarily. There's simply no way. Every time there's a war, Israel might batter Hamas and kill thousands of Palestinians, but I see no way, and I don't think anyone does, that Israel can win this war. It's just a matter of time till they have to figure out some other way of accommodating their neighbor. On to al-Qaeda, which is a larger and obviously sort of global entity, which has a totally opposite focus. It is to attack both apostate Muslim states, but also to strike at the United States, whom they seem as the guiding hand behind all of these Arab autocrats. And in many ways, they're right. I mean, we stand behind the Saudi royal family. The United States obviously backs King Abdullah of Jordan. We did back until his overthrow, Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, one of the most brutal dictators in the Middle East. Ben Ali of Tunisia was one of our guys. I mean, this is what causes problems for us worldwide. Pursuing what we have done, which is a policy of realpolitik, is pursuing your interests in a realistic manner, that has caused some of these reactions. Since September 11, al-Qaeda has been under attack by the United States and dozens of Western nations. And of course, what President Bush famously called the global war on terror. Al-Qaeda is the base in Arabic. At the end of his life, Osama bin Laden, of course, our pal showing up on the right-hand corner, felt that Al-Qaeda needed the word jihad to be put in there because it wasn't able to recruit effectively because its brand name had not included the struggle in its name. It's founded by bin Laden in 1988. He's a construction magnate in Saudi. His father had reconstructed for one the Kaaba, had refurbished it for the Saudi government, and had a lot of lucrative Saudi contracts. And of course, I think everyone knows that al-Qaeda conducted the most devastating terrorist attack on U.S. soil in history, with the Twin Towers attacks, the hijacking over Pennsylvania, and the attack on the Pentagon being really the pinnacle of their operations to this point. Bin Laden himself was born in 1957 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. In 1979, he graduated with a degree in civil engineering from Abdulaziz University in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and then headed immediately to Afghanistan to fight among the Mujahideen, the jihadi fighters fighting the Soviet Union. The Soviets intervened in Afghanistan to support the Marxist government of Hafizullah Amin, replacing him with Babrak Kemal, and basically every Soviet president, prime minister that was installed met a horrific end during or after the Soviet occupation. The Soviets tried to nation build in Afghanistan. They never committed as many ground troops as, say, we did in Vietnam or the French did in Algeria, but it was a significant Soviet effort to pacify and prop up what they viewed as an important region on their southern flank. Remember that at this time the Soviet Union controls all of what is now the Central Asian stands of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and so on. These are all in the Soviet Empire. Bin Laden fights he doesn't really fight so much as direct fighting and raise money and provide logistical support in 1980 to 86. It's dubious to assume that he was a great fighter and fought in a lot of battles. I don't really believe it personally, and the sources on this are sketchy. He certainly lived life like a man that wasn't in any hurry to die. He obviously clung to life until the last moment. So to see him as a great guerrilla fighter and a great guerrilla commander is probably fundamentally flawed. He establishes al-Qaeda in 1988. He uses a lot of personal Saudi money that he has and his Saudi connections to fund it. In 1989, the National Islamic Front, which is a radical group in Sudan, took power, and as the Soviet war is winding down in Afghanistan, it's the year that the Soviets pull out, bin Laden goes back to Saudi Arabia, but he suddenly, he doesn't get along well with the Saudi government. There's pressure on him, and there's finally a breaking point that follows with the 1990 invasion of Kuwait by the Iraqi state. Bin Laden tells the Saudi government he can defend the kingdom from the Iraqi military with his Mujahideen fighters, and the Saudis basically laugh at him and then call George Bush, and the United States and his coalition allies roll in and base themselves in Saudi Arabia. This is the turning point in bin Laden's, it's certainly not his views, but in his operational conduct, where he decides that the United States is the primary enemy, that they're the real cause of all this mess, and that they have to be attacked directly. And as early as 1992, his group is bombing the U.S. In Yemen, then in Sudan. From Sudan, his base in Sudan, there's the attempt on the first attempt on the World Trade Center with a car bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center. These are directed by bin Laden's group. He's ejected under U.S. pressure from Sudan in '96. And it's the same year that Bill Clinton, who's apprised of the seriousness of the threat, authorizes lethal force in an executive order against bin Laden. We have bin Laden in our sights a couple times in the late 90s with special forces teams, but never do we pull the trigger because it would have meant civilian deaths, the death of his families, and also the death of, at least on one occasion, sheikhs from the Gulf countries who are ostensibly U.S. allies. So they didn't want it messy. They wanted to be perfectly clean, and we missed our opportunities under Clinton to assassinate bin Laden. 96, bin Laden issues his famous declaration of jihad against the United States, and he provides fair warning that we're now at war with him and that we should expect attack, and he tells us why. His goals are to drive the United States from the Arabian Peninsula, free the holy sites of Mecca and Medina from the pollution of the infidel Americans, to overthrow the Saudi government, and to liberate, as I mentioned, the Muslim holy sites, as well as to then support Islamic revolutionary activity around the world and reestablish the caliphate and spread Islam globally. The 1998 bombings, bloody affairs in Kenya and Tanzania, left hundreds dead, thousands wounded, and first really brought home the capabilities of al-Qaeda. Nevertheless, despite this, and despite having knowledge of having good intelligence from several governments around the world, incompetence came to rule the order of the day. We did not catch the September 11th hijackers, and of course, I think you know the story, almost 3,000 dead in those attacks. And then on October 7th, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. Our costs to date, 2,144 killed, 17,674 servicemen wounded, and $635 billion spent in the war. We invaded Iraq, 20th of March 2003, for its ostensible weapons of mass destruction, which were never uncovered, and Saddam Hussein's non-existent links to al-Qaeda. U.S. losses in that war, 4,486 killed, 32,223 wounded, and a war cost of $813 billion. Al-Qaeda still maintains a loose affiliation with groups around the world, some of whom you see on the screen. There are others that have at one time or another come into the Al-Qaeda orbit, and they range from everything from groups in the Philippines, such as Abu Sayyaf, Jamaat Islamiyah in Southeast Asia, to the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and so on. So it still has a global reach. It's been badly undermined by the global war on terror. Today, al-Qaeda is struggling in Afghanistan. Its presence there is minimal. It's really the Taliban that we're concerned with in Afghanistan. But in Iraq, Syria, North Africa, al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda affiliates continue to be active and thriving and trying to establish themselves at the helm of a nation state. Increasingly, al-Qaeda fails in its mission to fight the far enemy, that is the United States and its allies, and has to limit itself to local wars. And I have in mind here the current conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Nigeria. Death of bin Laden on 1st of May 2011 was a U.S. victory, but I would argue largely symbolic. Bin Laden didn't really have firm control and never did over the organization. The organization itself, to call it an organization is it's not the best word. It's a syndicate of loosely affiliated groups that are largely independent, that conduct independent strategic operations and have independent tactics and independent funding, often from the main supposed hierarchy of al-Qaeda. So it is almost like a loosely grouped franchise with a lot of independent contractors doing as they will. Ayman al-Zawahiri is the current leader of al-Qaeda. He was long the number 2. He's an Egyptian physician and long-standing member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Ironically, of course, he fled Egypt because the Brotherhood was so severely persecuted by the government of Hosni Mubarak. And now his compatriots, the Muslim Brotherhood, are, of course, firmly in control of the Egyptian state, having won the elections there. So there have been rumors all around the internet, crazy stuff, that Zawahiri is going to go back to Egypt. I think that's unlikely. Sayyid Qutb, one of the ideological founders of the Muslim Brotherhood, inspires al-Qaeda. He's probably the most, not probably, he's the most influential intellectual on al-Qaeda and like-minded Islamist militants. The U.S. response obviously has been massive. If you think at the war on terror, think about what we've done. We've overhauled our government, created new cabinet-level department, Homeland Security, gargantuan military responses, that is, wars in 2 countries, interventions in many, many, many other countries, expansion of U.S. bases into formerly hostile countries like Algeria, for example, where we have drone bases and intelligence posts. Unthinkable 30 years ago. The Patriot Act and similar draconian laws that have curbed American civil liberties. Airport searches and security, the NSA cases of intercepting all electronics data, the new U.S. data center in Utah that's going to allegedly have the capability of intercepting and storing every single piece of electronic data generated in this country, possibly abroad. It's kind of makes one wonder and say, well, who won the war? Al-Qaeda is heavily attrited now. Much of its top leadership has been killed. And this has led to President Obama in particular to stress that Al-Qaeda has largely been dismantled, that they're on the run. That's largely true, but again, it really hides the fact that this is an organization that doesn't depend on a strong central command for its activities. It was never like that. It was never a centrally run organization, except in Afghanistan. And then, because it's sent out these sort of seeded groups throughout the Middle East, Central Asia, and so on, that have no dependence on this home team of bin Laden, Zawahiri, and so Libya, and all these guys that have been mostly killed or captured. It's not dependent on them for its continued survival, and that's why it's so dangerous to sort of assume that Al-Qaeda is just going away because we continue to blow them up with drone strikes. I mean, they're actually able to, at least the rank and file, to draw in new recruits. The question is whether it will be able to replace the expertise of people like Ramzi Youssef and other tacticians and other experienced fighters that really had some skill in conducting these kind of complicated foreign attacks. Global impact, as I mentioned, has been immense. There have been hundreds of attacks by Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda affiliates worldwide, and these have killed thousands of people, maimed thousands of people. Terrorism, for the first time, it's a global concern. You can't find a Western country without a major anti-terrorism presence. Militarily big business, and it's great business for jihadis. I'm thinking here of the Haqqani network, the Haqqani nexus as it's called, in the Pakistan tribal territories, that really it's flourishing. Its main occupation is to recruit and to fund and to make money off the jihad business, and business is good. Down but not out, as I mentioned, because there's no single entity of Al-Qaeda, there's no body of Al-Qaeda that you can just shoot. There are these endless tentacles of Al-Qaeda. The best example today is the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Once one of the prominent commanders of the AQIM, as it's called, is Mukhtar Bel-Mokhtar, also known as Mr. Marlborough, for his fortune he made and the money he raised smuggling cigarettes in West Africa that would go eventually, most of them, to Europe. Now leads the Sign and Blood Battalion. There's a public document that was leaked. Ayman al-Zawahiri scolds Belmokhtar for his attacks on Muslim civilians. That you're killing us over here. You're damaging the cause. You're making people turn against us. And Belmokhtar basically disregarded it, left the group, found a new jihadi group, and has been happily blowing up things across West and North Africa for the better part of the last year. He was supposedly killed during the French invasion. That turned out not to be true. The French invasion that is still ongoing in Mali. And as recently as June 2013 has attacked the French in Niger, into the uranium mining complex, and a suicide attack also in Niger and in Mali. He is taking responsibility for those. Also famous, the Amenas gas facility, in which he his group kidnapped more than 800 gas workers, many of them Americans or Western Europeans, and many of them were killed in the Algerian military response that tried to storm the facility. Belmokhtar, that was in January of 2013. Belmokhtar was behind that attack as well. So he's still out there and represents a considerable